All right, hello everyone. Welcome. This is Yoga Talks Podcast. My name's Jay Brown. Thank you so much for listening. Those of you who tuned in last week can hear that I didn't hesitate in introducing the podcast, largely because of the many emails you guys sent me. Your support and your reassurances that the name of the podcast is just fine, I should leave it alone. I'm going to take your advice. Thank you so much for all of your messages. I really appreciate hearing those little tidbits about your life and how the podcast is fitting in, that you're getting something from it. It just means the world to me. I really felt comforted to know that you're out there. So thank you, everybody who sent me those notes. I really appreciate it. This week, I feel like doing better than I was last week. Not that I was doing bad last week, but as I mentioned, I was feeling paralyzed by focusing on like big significant things. So my mind was scrambling to worry about insignificant things. Well, this week I'm not worrying as much. I mean, part of it, frankly, is that I've been on a little bit of like a media blackout of sorts where I'm not consuming news as much. Instead of scrambling to find things that are insignificant to worry about, I've been really trying to take that energy and put it into like getting right inside myself, because that's the only thing I can do right now. I can't change those big things I don't have any control over, but I can try to just do the things that I can do for myself right now. And I have to admit, those of you who've been listening to the podcast may remember there was a time where I was being very open and talking about my screen addiction. And man, the last couple of weeks, it's off the charts. It's out of control. I mean, I've got a plan though. Here's what my plan is, and I haven't done it yet. I'm mentioning it now because if I mention it out loud on the podcast, I'm hoping to force my hand. My plan is to delete the Facebook and Twitter apps from my phone. And I haven't done it. It's crazy. Like this concern that I have that if I do that, I'm just going to mess things up or something. I really don't think it is. I can still go on my computer but really the issue for me is that I caught myself the other day again where I was in the room with my daughter, and in my mind, I was hanging out with her, but I was too often on my phone, and I think to her, I wasn't even really hanging out. It's like my attention would be with her for a time, and then I'd be like, catch a moment to like tune out, and then back to her, and then tune out. And you know what? That's bullshit. That's not the engaged person that I want to be. That's not how I am when I'm here teaching classes and interacting with people. So why am I not bringing that kind of like awareness and being present to the time I spend with my own children? Because I've got this device that makes it this easy. I mean, maybe it's not the device, maybe it's me. So I don't know, at least it's a step, you know? So darn it, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. When I finish recording this, I'm going to delete those apps from my phone, my friends. I'm going to see what happens. It's not like I can't just put it back. I can't put the apps back on if I want. But amazing how much of like my behavior is being shaped by this stuff. And so I don't know. I feel like in a way that's like a counter-revolution or something. It was like, I don't know. My friends, we must examine these technologies that have like become ubiquitous in our lives and make sure that they're serving us. Whew, I didn't intend to go there. Wow. But that's the truth. That's the truth of the moment, my friends. Let's talk about the podcast. Today, I am talking to Erich Schiffmann. And I was so excited to have this opportunity. It's funny, getting him on the podcast was easier than I thought it would be. I just went to his website, and if you go to his contact page, and I hope I'm not making trouble for him by mentioning this, but if you go to his contact page on his website, there's not like the new embed form that's usually there these days where you put your name in and the message and the email and then you hit send. There's just an email address. His personal Gmail address is there, and you can just email Erich Schiffmann. I don't know if you know that, but if you want to email Erich Schiffmann, you can. I did. And he got back to me. It took a little while. We tried a couple times before we nailed down a time, and then we ran into some technical difficulties. We spent 30 minutes trying to troubleshoot a situation with his computer, which we didn't end up resolving, and we had to resort to a plan B, but it ended up working out just fine, and we had an amazing talk once we settled into it. Erich is a really prolific teacher, and there's so much here, so I'm really excited for you to hear it today. Before we listen to the podcast, though, I want to mention a few things. First, there's something that Erich talks about with me today, which is that one of his annual gigs that he's been doing for 25 years is a retreat at a place called the Feathered Pipe Ranch. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of this place, but it is this famed retreat place in Montana that these amazing teachers go to every year. Erich Schiffmann being one of them, Lilias Folan, Judith Hansen Lassiter. Some really big teachers go there every year. And Erich, after 25 years, has decided to step away from that annual gig. And it just so happens that a week before I talked to him, I was contacted by somebody at the Feathered Pipe Ranch asking me if I would be interested in doing a program there. That was before I knew that Erich was stepping away from his time there. And before I knew much about the Feathered Pipe Ranch, I had heard of it, but when I really looked into it, it's this, like I said, famed place where, one of the earliest yoga retreat places you could go to. And everybody talks about it with this certain air of mysticism. And I talked with the founder, India Sapira, and she's just this amazing woman. And so I'm going to do this retreat at the Feathered Pipe Ranch. And, I've never done a retreat in all the many years that I've been making my living as a teacher. I've never done a retreat because usually when you do a retreat, it's really on the teacher to get the people there. The destination spot, they don't really bring enough people. It's on you to bring your people with you. And I don't know, it just seems like getting people to leave their lives for a week and drop a chunk of cash, it just felt like a lot of pressure that I never wanted to take on. And so I've never done it. I've never done a retreat, but I'm going to do one now. I'm going to do this retreat at the Feathered Pipe Ranch, June 17th, 2017. And I'm doing it because it's the Feathered Pipe Ranch. And when I mention, you'll hear to Erich about it, he says it's his favorite place on the planet, and you definitely have to go. So I'm going, and I'm hoping that some of you out there will join me. I expect it to be kind of a special thing. Certainly new for me. I want to maybe record a podcast or two while I'm there in Montana. I don't know. I just think it'll be amazing. And if you can swing it, come hang out with me. Let's go to the Feathered Pipe Ranch in June 2017. There's a link for it on the website, jbrownyoga.com. But in the meantime, I actually have some gigs coming up right now. Actually, this coming weekend on Sunday, December 4th, I'm going to be in Garden City, New York at Samudra Yoga. And then February 26th, I'm going to be in Tarrytown, New York at Riverstone Yoga. So come hang out, come have some practice with me. You can get those gigs again at jbrownyoga.com. Let me also mention that we're going to run a little promo for podcast listeners. We haven't done this in a long while, but sometimes when somebody I've been really looking to get on the podcast comes on, we celebrate with a promo. So if you go to jbrownyogavideo.com and enter promo code ERICH15, that's ERICH, the way Eric spells it, ERICH 15, you can get 15% off any DVD downloads or the online workshop, Gentle is the New Advanced. That's ERICH15, jbrownyogavideo.com. All right. I think that's probably good. Let's listen to me and Erich Schiffmann. Well, Eric, thanks, man, for taking some time to talk to me. It's just such an honor and a pleasure to have a little bit of time to chat with you today.
Yeah, I'm glad we finally got this together.
So I have never met you before, but I have been in your class once, but you would not remember. I took a class with you. I want to say, I'm not exactly sure but I think it was the late 90s, and it was in Santa Monica at Yoga Works, I believe, on Montana Avenue. Is that possible?
Yeah, wow.
I think that was like the first spot, right?
That was a long time ago.
Well, I remember I took one class with you, and it was at a totally different time in my life. I was in probably my most achievement-oriented time in practice.
Uh-huh.
And I remember, I went to the center, and I just went to, what the most popular class was, the class that, the most people were going to go to, and that was your class. Mm-hmm. And I remember enjoying it, but it didn't really kick me in my ass the way I wanted it to.
Right.
And but later on, as the years have gone on, I eventually came to practice much more inspired by Jessica Char teachings, and then you really have become kind of a figure for me. And I've learned a lot from you, even though I've never had a chance to directly study with you. So it's a great honor for me to have time like this. And I looked at your website, and you have a very excellent bio. I have to say, I talk to these yoga teachers, and sometimes I go check them out, and your bio is quite extensive, which is great. And I don't want to make you have to talk about a bunch of stuff that you've already talked about a million times. But there were some things in your bio, like some people in your bio whose names I didn't know, and I did want to ask you about some of your history. And I know that you always say that your brother gave you a yoga book when you were 12.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, how old was your brother, and why did he have yoga books hanging around? What was your household like that you guys just had yoga books around to give you at age 12?
I know that is interesting, and it's fun looking back and just seeing the steps of how a life happens or how a discipline happens. And he gave me the book. I was either 10 or 12. I don't really remember, but I just remember thinking, what a stupid birthday present. I put the book in a drawer, why did you waste my birthday present on a yoga book? And I didn't even look at it for a couple of years. And then I was cleaning out the drawer. I found the book, and he wasn't into yoga. My mother was actually, I remember her watching Richard Hittleman on TV. She had a couple of yoga books, but that was actually never an actual big influence on me.
So there was yoga in your house, but your brother wasn't into yoga. Why do you think he gave you a yoga book?
I think he just realized, it's Eric's birthday. I got to get him a birthday.
I got to get him something.
Yeah. And he doesn't remember it. I've still got the book. It was called the spirit and practice, or whatever it was, yoga. I titled my book after his book, just serve as a
little homage.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, well, then I know that you also talk about how you started reading Krishnamurti books in high school. And I'm just wondering, again, to me, that's amazing. Like, I came to Krishnamurti like in my college years, but that you sort of discovered him so much earlier on in your life. I'm wondering, how is it that, like, did you have friends that were into Krishnamurti in high school? I mean, how do you get into Krishnamurti in high school?
I know, exactly. I know. I know.
He's out there, man. He's like awesome, but like, how do you think that happened for you? How do you end up getting into Krishnamurti?
Well, sort of what happened was I grew up here in Southern California. I was a little surfer kid at the beach, actually. We lived about a mile from the beach. I remember I used to ride my skateboard to the beach. It was sort of like a long, sloping downhill in Palos Verdes. So I'd ride the skateboard with a surfboard on my head, and I'd go surfing. And my mother would pick me up in the afternoon, to take me home. And all my surfing idols at the time were into Meher Baba and Yogananda. So I started getting into yoga largely because I was just copying my surfing idols. And at one point, one of my best friend gave me a book by Krishnamurti. It was called Think on These Things. And I just remember thinking, wow, that's the best book I've ever read.
Yeah.
I couldn't put it down. I started reading every book I could by him, like for years. And at one point, I used to go to the Bodhi Tree bookstore on Melrose. I think closed recently. But I found a book there called Brockwood Talks. And it was a school that was started in England by Krishnamurti and his friends, and it was like a high school. And I just remember thinking, wow, there's nothing else I'd rather do than go meet Krishnamurti, meet people that were into Krishnamurti's teachings, and learn yoga the way Krishnamurti was doing it. And so I couldn't really explain to myself why that was interesting to me. I couldn't explain it to my parents why that was interesting to me. But I just had this like primal urge to where, I just got to do that, Mom, and I got to go to England.
Wow. And they were supportive?
Yeah. Well, it was sort of like they didn't know what else to do, so they let me do it. So the money that we'd been saving for me to go to college, we spent so that I could go do that. And sort of the thought was, I'll go do this for a year, and then I'll come back and go to art school.
You're going to go to Europe to find yourself and then come back, right?
Yeah. And it's interesting to sort of, I remember at the time feeling like, I just really want to get away from everything that I know, every influence about what I'm supposed to be doing, and just sort of get in touch with whatever it is I'm supposed to be doing. So like having the break from the known was really good. I was a teenager at that point.
Yeah, and I mean, and Brockwood, was that kind of like home base for the Theosophical Society?
No, not for the Theosophical Society. Krishnamurti had left the TS a long time ago, and
I see. Before you were hanging out with him.
Yeah, so it was sort of Krishnamurti people that wanted to start a school.
Okay, all right, and I know that there was another name that popped up in your bio that I hadn't heard that you mentioned as like a first yoga class with Jim Fowler. I don't know who he is. Who's Jim Fowler?
Yeah, Jim was the yoga teacher at Brockwood.
Okay. So that's when you took your first yoga class there at Brockwood when you went there.
Exactly. So my first yoga class was at Brockwood with Jim Fowler. He was a student of Desikachar. I'd never heard of Desikachar before. I'd never heard of Iyengar, pretty much. I get that point.
So the type of yoga practice you were getting at Brockwood was sort of out of the Desikachar teachings.
Was Desikachar style, yeah.
And that's really interesting. Because I know, my friend Mark Whitwell, he talks a lot about like Desikachar's kind of relationship to the Krishnamurtis, and not just J Krishnamurti, but UG Krishnamurti. Did you ever meet UG Krishnamurti?
I met UG a number of times. Yeah.
Wow, because he was there when you were there.
He wasn't at Brockwood, but he was in.
Oh,
he was in Switzerland when the other Krishnamurti was giving talks and song.
Right. He would have his own little side tent or something like that.
Exactly. Right? So I saw Yuji in Switzerland, and he was also in Palm Springs, and I went out to see him there a couple times.
Well, anyways, that might get a little bit ahead, because I know also you went at some point to study with Desikachar, right?
Yeah. So I was a teenager at Brockwood Park School in England, studying with Krishnamurti and doing school there. Loved it. It was a small school. There were 40 students and 40 staff members, vegetarian school, doing yoga. Krishnamurti lived there for not quite half the year, but he was there quite a lot. So we got to see him a lot, talk with him a lot. And towards the end of my first year there at Brockwood, I said to Krishnaji that I'd like to, learn yoga more seriously. And I asked him who he would recommend, what should I do if I really wanted to get into this? And he suggested Desikachar. So I wrote Desikachar a letter and made a little prayer when I put the letter in the mailbox. And I sort of thought he'd never respond, but I got a letter back. Yes, please come to Madras. And next thing you know, I was on the plane flying to Madras.
Wow. And so cool that you had that direct interaction with Krishnamurti, because I know when I look back to when he was sort of the head of the Theosophical Society, he had those huge crowds always. So that you had that one-to-one interaction with him.
Yeah, I mean, there were huge crowds, but at the school especially, there were huge crowds when he was giving public talks, but at the school, it was just like a normal school. It was like a big mansion out in the countryside of England. It was very beautiful, and I don't know, I felt very fortunate. Most everyone felt very fortunate to be there. And so he would come down and eat lunch, every day. And as many times as possible, I would sneak in so early so I could sit next to him or across from him at the table. And if not actually talk to him, be able to hear everything he was talking about and watch what he ate. And,
And did he feel like an accessible guy you could just hang out with?
Well, it wasn't quite like you'd hang out with him, especially because, I was just a little teenager.
Yeah. I don't know. I just see him on these YouTube videos and read his books, and he says all these incredible things. But to just kind of imagine sort of hanging out next to him and having lunch.
Yeah. So it was like that. Like the hangout part was being able to eat lunch with him and talk with him, but it wasn't quite how I would describe it, hanging out.
Yeah. I gotcha.
And then a couple times a week, there would be public talk, group talks for the school and for the students at the school. So those were small, wasn't a huge public event, but so you'd be in the room with 30, 40 other people, and you could ask them anything you want and have intense conversations back and forth. It was special, actually. It was just really fun, and he was very open and very willing to talk about anything. It was cool.
And were there a lot of Westerners there when you were there?
Well, there were 40 students, but they came from, I think, 14, 15 different countries. So it was a big mixture of people. Huh. And most of the students were there were the children of parents that were interested in the teachings. And so I was one of the few students who was there voluntarily, or chose to be there.
It wasn't spiritual boarding school for you?
That's what it was. like I'd finished high school here in the States, so I didn't actually need to do any more high school stuff. So I just went there to actually do a spiritual boarding school with Krishnamurti.
Nice.
Well, and it was interesting, like being able to do classes without the pressure of exams. Like suddenly I got my take on what learning was about became very different.
So, all right. So now you go to Madras to study with Deskachar. And I have to say, like, there's like a very particular YouTube video of you talking about one of your main takeaways, which I show to every person who does teacher training with me. Which has to do with this idea that you went to lessons for a while and he wasn't saying much and you kept wanting him to talk about more, but he didn't do that until you asked him a question.
Exactly. That was interesting. Yeah.
I mean, even more and more, that idea has been huge in the yoga world, this idea of like not imposing upon someone's experience.
Yes. And that was like strange for me at first because I'd go to the class with him. They were all private classes with him in those days, and I was able to do 2 or 3 a week. And I'd go up into the room, I'd ride my bicycle over to their house. Krishnamacharya was always sitting on the porch, so I got to see him every time I went over there. I saluted him, Namaste Guruji, like every time. He never responded, and I remember thinking, this guy is so cool. He doesn't even respond when someone's prostrating to him. So I got to see Krishnamacharya. He was beautiful. His 2 front teeth were missing, but otherwise everything was like beautiful, perfect.
I didn't know that. How did that? I mean, that wasn't the case later on. Did he get him fixed or something? I guess.
I don't know. Or like most of the pictures, he's got his mouth closed, so you can't tell.
And that's what you remember. He didn't have his 2 front teeth.
Yeah. Wow. But then I'd go up to the class and have class with Deskachar, and I was thinking it'd be like a class where he'd start telling me what to do, and instead we would just sit there and he would talk, asking me about, did I like the food in India? How did I like the weather? Stuff like that. And this is what you're making reference to. And at a certain point I realized, look, I came halfway around the world in order to be with this guy, and my time is running out. I was there for a year, which is pretty long. But each week it was a little less, and he wasn't saying much at first. And I thought, well, what's up with this? He's, And then I realized, if I ask him a yoga question, then he was willing to respond. And once I understood that that's how it worked, then I came with hundreds of questions.
And do you remember what your first question was?
I have no idea.
Yeah, I'm sure it's too long ago.
That would be interesting. It would be so fun to watch the videos.
Yeah, if you could go back in time and figure out what that first question you finally figured out to ask was.
Yeah.
But then the ball rolled from there once you started asking your questions.
And he was only 34. You know what I mean? Like, he was just a baby at that point. I was 20. He was 34. He'd been teaching, not even very long.
I know, because he resist actually sort of taking up. He was like an engineer and kind of resisted becoming a teacher at first, and then finally decided to take it on.
Exactly.
Wow. So, all right. So you were there with him for a year, you said.
Yeah, which is pretty long. That's a long time to be there.
That is. And in that time, I know Deskachar is all about a personal practice. Did you feel like at the end of that you had a yoga practice?
Not really, not as much as I wanted to. I sort of knew what he wanted me to do, and I would try to do it, but still, it wasn't kicking in as much as I knew it could or should or would. Or
well, he had some mantras for you and some simple arm lifting and leg lifting kind of stuff.
No, we didn't do mantras, but it's more just asana practice and pranayama.
All right. So you, after a year with Desikachar, you where do you go? You go back to Brockwood?
Well, I was in India for the year, and then I thought, okay, I'm going back home. I'll finally go to art school. Is sort of what I thought. But on my way back, I stopped at Brockwood just to say hi to the people, and they said, well, Jim Fowler, who was teaching here, he decided to take a break, so we don't have a yoga teacher here. How would you like to be the yoga teacher? And I almost fell over, and it was sort of like, you kidding? I can't think of anything else I'd rather do. And it was just felt like this magical door opened for me that I didn't personally orchestrate. And it just, again, it felt like one of these mystical, magical configurations. And I just said yes to it. I'll go to art school next year. I kept putting it off. And like there's nothing else I'd rather do. And so I started teaching yoga there at Brockwood.
And I read that you were teaching teenagers when you got back. Is that right?
Yeah, because Brockwood's a high school. They do the A levels and the O levels in preparation for college. So it was high school, and so my first introduction to teaching was a bunch of high school students, and they would sign up for the class. It wasn't mandatory that you take yoga, though. It was sort of thought that, like, if you were at Brockwood, you would want to take yoga. It was Krishnamurti encouraged people to take yoga, but it wasn't mandatory. But just about everyone signed up for the yoga class, and it would be like you'd go do your physics for one period, and then you'd do your biology, and then next period you go to yoga class. So I was having short, like probably 45-minute periods, classes of privates, like all day long with individual students, and there's a lot of privates. But it was like good practice for me.
I bet. And were you using the stuff that you learned from Desikachar? Or were you drawing upon other stuff? I mean, that was your experience, Jim's class and Desikachar's stuff, right?
It was all Jim's stuff and Desikachar's classes, yeah. And when I was with Jim, he would, at the end of class, he would always write down what we did, like little stick figures. And I've got, in a box somewhere, I've got all the little drawings that he did. So I referenced the classes that he taught and all the notes that I took with Desikachar, and was teaching these high school kids. And, some of them were into it and some of them weren't. But they had to keep class, so I got a lot of practice teaching.
Well, I imagine I haven't spent time teaching teenagers a lot. I have once or twice, but it's a totally different ball game. Yeah, there's such a different place in life,
Yeah.
Not many high school kids are into Krishnamurti like you were.
Right, yeah. So mostly, yeah. Again, like the kids there were there because their parents wanted them to be at the school largely. But once they got there, it was a cool place, and everyone is into Krishnamurti and the teaching. So like, it was a nice mix.
Yeah. All right. Well, then I guess where I go next is you mentioned these this gatherings in Switzerland, in Stade, Switzerland, these big tents, and I romanticize them so much because I heard so much about them. I know some people who were there, and they always reference them as such an important experience. And so you were there,
yeah.
And so, can you say something about that? Like, how many times did you go? I know it happened like annually, right? Like it happened every year. Did you go more than once? Did you go one time? Like, what was your experience of going to those gatherings in Switzerland?
I probably went to they weren't in Stade, actually. They were in a little town next door to Stade called Saanen.
Okay.
And so there'd be might be the Saanen River goes through, and they put up a big tent, like a huge tent. Krishnaji stayed in Vanda Scaravelli's house in Stade, and they'd come over and give the talks in Saanen. I was probably I went there probably 5 times. Again, it's like Switzerland, mountains, trees, river, mystical tent, lots of people, lots of hippies, lots of people camping out, and then Krishnaji comes up and delivers a talk and
it blows everybody's mind.
Yeah. It was fortunate. I feel lucky to have been there. Like, you would have liked it.
I totally would have loved that.
Yeah.
It sounds like a kind of amazing thing to have been part of. And there's also some other people that you referenced that you met there, some names that I don't really know also. Donna Holloman and Mary Stewart.
Yeah.
Where do they come into it for you?
Well, okay. So I was teaching at Brockwood, and students were from everywhere. And one day, the father of this French boy showed up at Brockwood. His name was Jean-Bernard Ricci, J.B. Ricci. And he introduced himself to me, and we started talking. It turns out he was an Iyengar teacher in Paris.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I heard about him because Judith Hanson Lassiter mentioned him, if I'm not mistaken. She studied with him at her early times.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that. Most people have never heard of him. I don't even know if he's still on the planet.
I think he might be, because Judith mentioned him, and he was one of her early teachers, actually.
Yeah. So he was a teacher, and Iyengar teacher. He introduced himself to me at Brockwood, and we just started talking, and I was just a little kid, you know what I mean, I'd spent a year with Desigachar, but it's still, like, I was a total novice teacher. And it was I never met a yoga teacher who was making a living teaching yoga, and you know, like a mature man, and his name was Rishi, and so, like, we talked, and I did a private lesson with him at Brockwood, and he showed me stuff with props, and it was just suddenly, it was like, wow, this is interesting. I love what he's talking about, the alignment and all these things. And so that was my introduction to Iyengar yoga. Hearing it from him, I went to Paris and studied with him, and to the French Alps. I did a couple of workshops with him. And somehow I met Mary Stewart, and Mary Stewart was a teacher in London. Somehow I met Mary. I used to go to her house on the weekends, and she let me assist her classes. So I learned a lot about Iyengar yoga from her. Mm-hmm. She eventually switched to Scaravelli style yoga, but her teacher at the time was Donna Holloman. And Donna was...
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so Donna... Are you familiar with Donna?
Not really, no. That's why I asked, because there are names that I mean, Scaravelli I know, and Mary Stewart I know of, but Donna I hadn't heard of.
Yeah, Donna was, like, huge. She was, like... Well, she was living in Italy when I met her, but she was, like, one of Iyengar's very top students, very popular in Europe. And Mary suggested that I go study with Donna. So during Christmas vacation, spring vacation, summer vacation at Brockwood, I'd fly to Florence, Italy, and stay at Donna's house. And she was 34 at that time. You should check her out.
I will. I mean, it's just amazing to me, like, your teacher training consists of going to stay with your teacher.
Yeah.
Basically.
Yeah.
That was your training.
There was no actual teacher trainings back then.
No. I mean, there wasn't when I came into it, actually. I saw that happen when it first started, but that's sort of how it happened. You just, you found a teacher that you want to study with, and they agreed to teach you, and then you went and stayed with them.
Yeah.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.